So welcome everyone to this open discussion on what it might mean to move towards a neurodevelopmentally aware and trauma responsive Ireland. I suppose the idea is to kind of discuss whether we think this is a good thing, whether it is desirable or not, what we can do together, what we can do individually as well, because I think we can make some impact individually, but we can make a lot more impact collectively. So I'm Jane Mulcahy. I know a lot of you already, but not all. And I'm delighted to get to know you now and in the future. And I've been interested in trauma and ACEs now for several years. I suppose, like many of you, I guess I always knew that harmful things might have an impact on people, but it wasn't until I was doing my PhD with long sentence male prisoners, and they told me very quickly, without me asking them, about some horrendous things that happened to them in childhood, living with, say, a severely mentally ill single mom who intermittently would try to end her life, stealing food, living with domestic violence, being physically assaulted and the like, and then living in very poor communities. So it's not just one thing or the other. And what we now know really is you can withstand a lot of harmful things, but if you have no one in your life to help you make sense of it, if you have no one in your life to cherish you and say that you're not responsible for the bad things that happened to you, that's actually what really cements the harm. So like the thing in the blurb about we are the medicine, I truly believe this. I don't think we'll ever have enough mental health services or enough social workers or enough this, that, and the other services. But I do think we can all be there a little bit more for one another, be a little bit more available to one another, be a little bit more present for one another. And so that's my invitation, really. How can we do this together and individually though as well? And how can we mind ourselves in being more generous to one another? So I won't rattle on any more at this point. The goal of it in the second half is to break into little small discussion groups and have a think and a chat about what we'd like to see happen in the future. And I've 3 speakers today who've kindly agreed to share their experiences and their work and their reflections on why they think this is worth pursuing. So the first speaker, I'd like to invite Cadhla to tell us a little bit about early years and education. So Cadhla, if you can just introduce yourself really and tell people what you do and why you think trauma is significant and why we need to pay attention to neurodevelopment and the like, I'd be thrilled. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Jane. And first of all, I'd just like to say thank you and hello to everyone. I'm so delighted to be involved in this because trauma and ACEs is something that I've always been interested in. Just to give a brief background on myself, I did my undergrad in social science in UCC. So I was always very interested in mental health modules, and then went down the route of trauma and ACEs, but more so to do with how it manifested in adults. So then after that, I went on to do my master's in Queen's University in Belfast in children's rights. So obviously violations to their rights. Again, I was always very focused on mental health. And that led me on to do my PhD in peace building and early childhood development. So we were typically looking at how we can invest in early childhood development to bring about peace building. So we would work in low middle income countries. And I suppose the main thing that it was based on, the project that I'm working on, was a study that was done in 2017. And it found that 250 million children within those low middle income countries are at risk of not reaching their full developmental potential. And that's just children that are under 5 years of age. So that works out at about 46% of those children who are not reaching their developmental potential, who are suffering lifelong effects because of what's happened to them in their early years. And again, I think that sums up quite a lot. It's what's happened to them. It's not what's actually wrong with these children. And I think just framing it in that way is really important. So then talking to a lot of people in Ireland, I suppose they think, well, that doesn't really happen here because, you know, Ireland's not a war-torn country or it's not affected by conflict. But then we would use the nurturing care framework. So that looks at, you need 5 essential components for children, which is good health, adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, security and safety, and opportunities for early learning. And I think particularly in Ireland, there's like this sense that you'll be grand, you'll get on with it, and children are resilient, which they are. I think the children are so resilient, and especially within that early years, 0 to 6, they really are, and they can adapt really well. But it doesn't mean to take away the fact that they're not affected by trauma and ACEs. So I think that I would typically look at the first 1,000 days. And myself and Jane have talked about this, where that's not at 0 to 6. That is while they're still in the womb. The, you know, prenatal period is so important. So even if children haven't been affected firsthand by trauma, they could be affected through their mother or their caregivers. So if you look at a mother who has, you know, suffered with their mental health throughout pregnancy, children will absorb that in the womb, and then that affects their development later on. And there has been clinical studies that link pregnant women's exposure to a range of traumatic experiences to stressors in children. And that does affect their neurodevelopmental abilities. So I think if I was to look at it, even in the work that I have done with children, we had a child that came to us in a preschool, and the parents were really looking to, you know, get a diagnosis for him for ADHD or autism, which is something wasn't really sitting right, you know, with me about it. And, you know, again, he would go through the very fight, flight, freeze. If he was put in a situation that he maybe felt, when we look back now, was threatened. And it turns out when we actually talked to the parents, she had a really traumatic pregnancy. She was going through cancer treatment while she was pregnant with him. And then it all starts making sense. And I think for me, the main thing is, it's not to take away the fact that ADHD is very real, autism is very real. But in the studies that I have done and the research I have done, there is that overlap that proves that we need to be, as early years educators and anyone working in the field, need to be so aware of, because there is that overlap of conditions, the inability to listen, or, you know, the fight, flight, freeze. They're all overlapping of ADHD conditions, autism, and they could be undiagnosed trauma, and we have to be aware of that, or PTSD even. So for me, I think that even though I definitely agree the children are resilient and they do adapt really well, I think that because they can't verbalize it, sometimes it's just seen as not important. But for me, I think it's even more important then, because we need to find ways of helping them deal with it by creating safe spaces and, you know, helping them develop self-regulation skills. So sorry for rambling on, but that for me is why it's so important, because essentially your early years are your building blocks for future. And if you don't have that support in those early years, it's not going to, you know, everything they do subsequently is going to, you know, have a knock-on effect. So that's just in a quick nutshell some of the research that I've been doing, and I'm really looking forward to having some breakout sessions later, and feel free to ask me any questions, or I'm looking forward to talk to you all anyway. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Kayla. I'm sure there will be questions for you later on, or comments in the group that you end up in, and it was very thought-provoking. I think as well that discussion about the potential overlap with ADHD and at least some autism presentation and trauma symptoms is fascinating, because if we don't routinely ask people, you know, just ask the questions, then we will be more aware of what the true overlap is. Whereas if we only ask certain people or certain groups, or are too afraid to ask at all, then we may not know. So thanks very much for that. I'm going to invite Niamh O'Rourke now to speak a bit about her work as a social worker with the Inclusion Health team. Niamh, so if you can unmute yourself and tell us all about your exciting work and why you think we need to tune into the health impacts of trauma, please.
Hi everybody, I recognise some faces from people I stalk on Twitter. It's nice to see you in person and at a distance, if even. So as Jane said, I am the Inclusion Health Senior Social Worker on the Inclusion Health team in St James's Hospital. I've worked in medical social work for about 8 of the last 10 years. And I've also worked in child protection and welfare from both a statutory and a voluntary agency basis prior to that. And I started off in preschool work. So a lot of what Cadhla was saying was really, I was nodding along going, yes, I've seen those kids, I've seen those kids. I worked in the preschool setting in Bernardo. So to say that trauma has and adversity in childhood has come across every single post I've ever held since the age of 20 would probably be an understatement. What we see in the Inclusion Health team in James is we work primarily with people who are experiencing homelessness, and often people that are experiencing homelessness alongside active addiction as well. So we see, unfortunately, we see really, really early preventable deaths in a population that are really, really unwell. They have multiple comorbidities from a very young age. So what we see is that people would have the same kind of frailty in their bodies and the same ability to walk and traverse stairs as you would see in a regular population, in the general population in about an 80-year-old. We see it in the homeless population in 30s, 40s, and if they're lucky, to last a 50-year-old. We see health impacts directly and indirectly related to physical abuse that might have happened very early in childhood. We see health impacts directly related to the balm that they've given themselves to try and get away from that trauma, from the addictions. So we see those very real health impacts of there's awful infections that I won't even get into that people have because of injecting drug use or drug use generally, or alcohol use. But in a general sense, what we see is we see people too sick, too frail, too early, and they die too soon. And I suppose to say that that happens for everyone who has experiences of trauma is really not the case. So we also, alongside that, we see as well a huge amount of resilience in the population. We see people exiting out of homelessness when they eventually get the right supports available to them. So for example, there is a gentleman that I worked with over the last 2 to 3 years. He is a gentleman in his 50s. He's a really, really low lung function and would have had a history of chronic physical abuse and neglect from very early childhood, and had stays in and out of prison over the years. He has been housed for the last 18 months and his lung function has increased and he's loving his home. And all he wanted was somewhere where he could have a kettle, a TV, and a paper. And he has those 3 things now. And he writes me letters every 2 weeks to tell me how much better his life is and how his health outcomes has improved, marginally so, but his quality of life is improved because the right supports have been put in place for him. So anytime we have these conversations, I'm always acutely aware that a lot of what we see in inclusion health is absolutely horrific for people. But we see the multiple service failures over generations that have occurred for populations. To say St James's Hospital is situated in a low socioeconomic area would be understating the issue. But it's also really important to realise that all of this is not deterministic. We don't have to see these early preventable deaths if we can intervene at those early stages like Cadhla is talking about. So for me, having a staff in an acute hospital system that are aware of the possibility of people having experienced trauma and aware that we should be dealing with people in a person-centered way and asking what they think and they know should happen for them next can be revolutionary for their healthcare needs going forward. And I don't think it should just be happening for people in homelessness, obviously. It should be across the board. So to say that I've been stalking Niamh O'Rourke on Twitter for a number of years would be an understatement also. So I'm very excited to be invited by Niamh O'Rourke via Katrina Mcmahon to talk this evening. And I'm excited to hear what other people's experiences are too.
Thanks, Niamh. You made me laugh there. You know, that's just too funny to me. But I feel the same way about so many people that I come across at various things. It used to be so nice to actually meet people in real life. So maybe one day again. But I love that phrase that you used there about the balm that they give themselves, I think was how you put it, in terms of the drugs, you know, or alcohol, I guess, whatever it is, to soothe the nervous system for people, and that people can have, you know, improvements in quality of life when they experience a bit of kindness and compassion as well. You know, I think that is not always well understood. So thank you so much for the work that you do. Thanks also to Cadhla, but I think this is particularly, you know, challenging work. No doubt very, very kind of uplifting at times when things go well, or you can see positive progress for people. But as you say, it would be fabulous if we could intervene long before people are homeless and with terrible infections and, you know, running themselves into the ground. But we're going to move on now to Katrina Mcmahon, who is going to kind of follow on from that in a way, because we're going to stick with health, but now move to mental health and suicide prevention. So Katrina, if you can unmute yourself and share your views and experience with us, we'd all be delighted. Thank you.
Yeah, no bother at all. As the girls are speaking there, it's like a fireworks show in my mind. I just, so many things I want to talk about, and so many things, jotting things down here, good. But yeah, I just love these conversations, to be honest with you. And it's a pleasure to be invited along today. So yeah, my name's Katrina McMahon, and I'm one of the co-founders of Community Crisis Response Team. So we are an out of hours organisation that travel to people that are suicidal at night. So we kind of work opposite the mainstream services. So we come on duty at 5 p.m. and we come off duty at 6 a.m. just when they're about to kick back in. So in addition to that, I'm also a postgraduate researcher focusing on child trauma in TUS. And I'm also, due to my own personal circumstances, a survivor of suicide myself. So today I kind of want to bring all those hats together and I suppose give you the best overview that I can of why this kind of a talk is so important, you know, and this get together. So like when Cadhla originally saved me from suicide, and this is going back some years ago, and when she did, it was in the middle of the night, and when she did, I was extremely lucky because she picked up on one sentence that I said, and I slammed down the kettle and I said, it's not going to matter anymore anyway. And she wasn't trained at the time what to pick up on. She just happened to pick up on that phrase. She said, what do you mean? She questioned it. Thankfully, we got help. It wasn't as simple as that, trust me. There was a lot of swear words thrown in, but nevertheless, we are back talking. I know, she was very good. She got me help and everything. So fast forward a few years later, we started looking at the situation, and given that it was the middle of the night, she had no training. She had no idea where to turn. Like, I didn't want to tell my family. I didn't want to go to hospital because I suffered anxiety. I had a fear of being locked in. It was just a nightmare situation for her, like, you know. So we looked at it and we were like, something needs to change. And we got training, and long story cut short, we identified a huge gap. And that gap was meeting people where they're at community level. So we set up CCRT in 2016 and we started responding to people. And from there, we discovered very quickly that we weren't just responding to suicide. We were responding to complex needs, everything from homelessness, poverty, addiction, rape crisis. We were dealing with trauma. And we were back then and we looked at the social care degree in TUS. And that's where our journey really began, because it added a whole different layer to what we do. And we're so lucky that we did, because even as you were talking about their situations, girls, you were talking about kind of clients you've worked with and stuff. There was one particular situation that always stands out in my head. Myself and Cadhla were on scene together, and I remember 2 other emergency services had been to this address that day. And it's kind of the premise of my talk today. And it was actually a friend that rang us afterwards saying, look, is there anything you can do? You know, the ambulance was there, the guards were there. There was nothing they could do. You know, there was just nothing. So we said, okay, look, we'll give it a go. So we rocked on, and we were actually just after covering about Harry Ferguson and all this about, you know, being aware of your surroundings and how it can affect you. And I'll never forget, like, there was so many distractions. Like, it was sensory overload for a start when we arrived on scene. But in the midst of all that, there was this person that was just shriveled down to a quarter of their normal size. And you could see they hadn't eaten in days. They hadn't eaten in 7 days, I think it was. And not one of the emergency services had asked them. Now, if we had tore in there and did an intervention, it would have just gone straight over their head. So I remember literally sitting down on the floor beside him, and I said, what's going on? What's it like to be you this week? What's happened? And we took it from scratch. We went from there. And I remember saying, okay, they were kind of coming in and out of consciousness because they were starved, you know. And I just said to them, if you could have anything to eat right now, what would it be? And they said a particular sandwich. And we made a couple of phone calls, and that sandwich magically arrived at the door. And it was after that you could see the bit of, I'm not saying it stopped them being suicidal, but what I'm saying is we identified the need. First of all, we needed to stabilize them. And once they got that little bit of, okay, someone cares about me here, they started to come around, then the intervention started. We've actually heard back from that person last year saying they're in a really good place. But the moral of the story is the other services didn't identify this. You know, they came in, tick boxes or whatever they did. And that was something that we swore going forward, you know, was never going to happen on our watch. So today, really, I suppose I wanted to emphasize the importance of trauma-informed care, but not for just organizations or systems, or, you know, there's this, I think, thing out there that, oh, it's about creating the perfect environment with the perfect lighting. And, you know, it's not. It's also about us and our trauma histories as professionals. You know, are we going to be triggered in a room with someone? It's about so much more. And I believe that we need a trauma-literate society, you know, and that includes the professionals, but it also includes you, me, everyone here today, everyone at community level, you know, because communication is key in relationships. You mentioned that, Jane, at the start when we were warming up. You know, it all comes back to relationships. You know, every intervention we do, it comes back to connection and relationships. And there's a quote about child trauma that Bruce Perry, that I've come upon. I just read it out quickly if you don't mind. Though its effects may not be visible to the untrained eye, when you know what trauma can do to children, sadly, you begin to see its aftermath everywhere. And that's it. Like, once we've got this training, and I know everyone on here will identify with this, when you walk into an early childhood setting, or you walk into a particular setting, you just sometimes have to walk out because I'll say something I'll regret to the staff. But moral of the story is you can see its impacts everywhere. And a lot of the time, trauma is seen as the big events, you know, the disasters, terrorism, war, when often the real war is going on within four walls at home, you know. And the real war is people, there's devastating things happening behind these walls. And they're seen as the small traumas, you know, like neglect. That's not small. It has one of the most devastating impacts there can be, you know. So there's all these kind of things that these are, I suppose, all the different things I'd be looking at. But I know when I hit rock bottom, yeah, I was suicidal at the time, but years prior, there was stuff that other people missed. Like, I'm not saying it's their fault, but they didn't know what to look for. Like in school, I remember being crippled from school. I was a flight risk at school, being honest with you. I kept taking off, but instead I was put back into the same seat. No one ever asked why, you know. Doctors, I'd been to doctors with pains in my stomach, you know, all these somatic things happening, and no one ever asked why. We'll treat you for that bug, you must have a tummy bug. So things that we hear when we're on scene with people would be, we've heard rape victims that have said we've been accused of telling lies to the Gardaí or to the emergency services because our memories are fragmented. And we all know that's a trauma response. People get frustrated, tell me the truth, you must be lying. Substance misuse is seen as, you know, oh, it's a disgrace, it's not treatable, we can't treat you here at this service. Children, again, with their, you know, if their behavior isn't the norm, so to speak, you know, they're seen as bold or disruptive or it needs to be corrected. And since starting our organization, I suppose one of the underlying themes we constantly hear coming through is a kind of a silence, and then we'll say, are you okay? And they'll say, this is the first time I felt heard. And I think that's powerful. That doesn't take a professional to hear someone. You know, I've often said to people, if I could do one thing for you right now, what would it be? And I remember one girl saying to me, just be real, just be honest. Sometimes I've said to people, it's like, and I know this isn't very professional, but it sounds to me like what you're going through is so shit right now. And if they burst out crying, going, finally, someone gets it, do you know? Other than that, I suppose one other thing we majorly deal with at the moment, and I spoke to Jane about this, is dual diagnosis. And when I say deal with it, it's something we struggle with at the minute. And it's very relevant to trauma, because dual diagnosis, as most of you probably know, it's when someone has a co-occurring addiction alongside a mental health diagnosis, or if they're suicidal. So for us, for example, if we have someone that's in suicidal distress, we get them to a point where they're stable. If we then try and get them mainstream help, we're being met with, oh no. We'll give them a leaflet there for mental health or for an addiction service. And then if I go to the addiction service, well, no, we can't treat the mental health side now. So what everyone's missing here is the person in the middle. You know, they're seeing addiction as, oh, I don't know, some sort of a hindrance or something, whereas it's a coping mechanism, as we all know. It's a way of surviving. It's kept them alive. I mean, this country, we even looked into it, it costs over 25,000 to go private to be seen for dual diagnosis. Short of robbing a bank, I don't think that's, very practical. So what can we do, I suppose, going forward? In my eyes, very much see the person, not the diagnosis. Hear what isn't being said, I think, is a huge one that we've learned through our work. People will often say, I'm fine, and your gut tells you they're not. Trust your gut. In our trainings, I often put up Dora the Explorer with the backpack. That's what you should be. Ask questions. The worst they're going to say is sling your hook, meet them where they're at. So that's kind of like the sandwich and stuff. Be prepared to sit in the shadows with them. I think that goes a long way. And to actively listen. So I suppose I covered a lot there, but it all kind of ties in as well with, the professionals, but also us in society. We all have a role to play. So thanks a million. Hope that wasn't too much.
Beautiful, Katrina. I was trying to mute myself there ineptly, but for kind of heavy material, you made me laugh again at various points, which is always kind of a form of medicine in itself, like a bit of levity at times when you're dealing with tricky material. And so much of what you said resonated with me. The real war is sadly often going on behind the walls at the family home, not always, but too often. And the no one ever asked why is a real abomination that I think is sadly in the histories of so many people. For example, one lady who writes a really great blog called The Flying Child blog about child sexual abuse. Beautiful writer, Sophie's her name. And recently enough, a teacher said to her, oh, we had our suspicions, or people were saying we had our suspicions, but no one ever asked. So I think the thing is, if we have any kind of suspicion at all about whatever it is, that someone might be feeling suicidal or might have some deep, dark secret that we just dare to ask. And what's the worst that can happen? They can tell us to F off or whatever. And also the validating statement of, it sounds to me that you're going through a shitty time. I mean, I think that's highly professional, actually, now, to just the use of the word shit, some people might take issue with, but it's real, it's authentic, and people feel that. So thank you so much again, Katrina, for sharing your own experiences. I'd say most people here probably agree that we have to listen to survivors at every point of view. And of course, many professionals are survivors, but they don't tell anyone. And as Katrina says, they can be activated and triggered all over the place. So that was a very important message too. I'm going to stop recording now, and I'm going to try and put us into breakout rooms.